Well, hello and welcome to a podcast being hosted by Onfido. My name is Parker Crockford. I'm the Director of Strategic Accounts and Policy and look after our positioning and regulatory relationships in the US and in other parts of the world. We're going to be talking today about what is the stimulus package has done to the state of identity, not only within the federal space and the challenges that agencies will have, but also in how do you get $2 trillion out the door. And to help me sort of walk through those conversations and to give us insight of what's happening, which seems to be changing hourly or daily, is our group of experts here. So I'm gonna hand it over to them to give a quick introduction, and then we're gonna dive into some of the questions and some of the pieces. Over the course of this webinar, I'll be monitoring our questions that you're able to submit, and so I'll break in if there's some interesting pieces that are pertinent to the conversation at that point. Otherwise, we'll be going through and answering some of those questions at the end of the webinar, and this will also be is being recorded, so you'll be able to view it later. And so, without taking up any more airtime and sort of conversation here, David, I want to hand it over to you to do an introduction, and we'll get this webinar started.
Great. Thank you, Parker, for hosting this, and thanks Onfido for putting this together. Really pleased to participate today. My background is 20 years in the payments industry, both at American Express in the prepaid group and also as the head of credit card strategy at JPMorgan Chase. And have also held several roles in the financial inclusion space. I was the head of Bank On, which is a nonprofit group that is a 70-city coalition that looks to connect people who are unbanked with safe and affordable bank accounts. And I'm also the co-founder of a fintech startup called Pedal, which is a credit card that uses cash flow underwriting to expand safe and affordable credit access for people who don't have a history of credit history. Most recently, I have been co-founding a group called the Alliance for Innovative Regulation. And what we are is a nonprofit organization that's really dedicated to helping regulators embrace technology and to leverage innovation and use innovation to integrate that into their own DNA. We have basically a three-pronged strategy that we work with: think, learn, and do, where we introduce intellectual capital. We have educational opportunities for regulators and for other thought leaders in the industry. And we also run demonstration projects like hackathons and tech sprints for regulators on specific topics. Most recently, we produced a hackathon to help the SBA demonstrate opportunities where they could improve the distribution of funds for the PPP. Today, we've got my co-founder Joanne Barefoot and myself. We have a bank think in American Banker, and we hope everyone here goes and reads that and finds that useful.
Thank you, David. Stu, over to you.
Hey, everyone. So first of all, thank you, Parker, for hosting and for doing this from Europe, evening your time. So I'm in Boston here on the East Coast. My role at MasterCard is really product management for digital identity and really market facing for the US market, part of the global digital identity product team at MasterCard. So we are in the process of building out a global network for digital identity with the governance and the tech, and really enabling an infrastructure network, much like the payments network, multi-party network, to enable better digital identity. And we're very active in the Better Identity Coalition as well, that Jeremy and Parker are part of, and Jeremy's actually chairing that. So my background is really in authentication, identity, encryption, and product and business development around that. I've been with MasterCard for a little over 2 years. So happy to be here today as part of this roundtable discussion.
Thank you,
Jeremy.
Stu. Now over to Jeremy, and Jeremy, please give that introduction and sort of give us that first opening salvo of what does the stimulus package mean, and what are some of the pieces that you've been active in and conversations with over the last couple of weeks.
Sure. Well, let me do an introduction first. I'm Jeremy Grant. Thanks to Parker and Onfido for giving me an excuse to put a suit on today. I didn't think I'd ever say I've reached the point in my life where I missed that experience, but I think we're pushing up against it. So this was good to reach into the closet and make use of the full wardrobe. I am in Washington, D.C. I am part of the cybersecurity and privacy practice at Venable, which is a D.C.-based law firm, though I'm not a lawyer. There's a bigger story there for another time. But my background's more than 20 years of experience at the intersection of industry, government, policy, and finance, all around digital identity and cybersecurity. I've spent time as a Senate staffer. I've spent several years in industry actually building a lot of early digital identity solutions, a few years as a market analyst at an investment bank, helping investors make sense of the space. And then I did a second stint in government from 2011 to 2015, leading an Obama administration initiative that was called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Bit of a mouthful, was known as NSTIC for short. And in that role, we were largely focused on working with in different segments of industry, including financial services, public sector, health, tech giants, and others, on how to catalyze a marketplace of identity solutions that could be more secure and better for privacy and better for the user than what we had in the market. During that role, I also served as the lead senior advisor at NIST for identity management and helped build out the Trusted Identities group that does a lot of research and standards in that space. I left in 2015, and I've been doing consulting since then, most recently through my perch at Venable. So as Parker and Stu mentioned, one of the projects that I've been heavily involved in the last couple of years has been the Better Identity Coalition, which was a group that was launched. We're up to about 24 companies now, between companies in banks, banking and payments like MasterCard, some of the vendors working on identity solutions like Onfido, tech giants like Microsoft, healthcare firms like Aetna, security firms in the middle, and it's been a pretty good group to bring together different stakeholders from different industries to come up with some consensus ideas on the policy front that detail what we actually need to try to do to make digital identity better. And so we'll talk, I think, a little bit about how some of those recommendations that we published in 2018 are now getting a lot of new attention as some of the inadequacies of America's digital identity infrastructure are really being laid bare now that we're all stuck at home and face-to-face transactions are, in most cases forbidden. So, I think that's going to be, a good chunk of our discussion today. Shifting a bit to the key question you asked, Parker, what am I seeing and hearing? So I'll say, the last month's been an interesting one. I've had a lot of former colleagues in government and industry, both reach out and say, look, if we're trying to, push out all of this aid to people, both individuals and small businesses, how do you do it without, in many cases, knowing who they are? And, the answer is it's a real challenge. So, we're seeing both, Treasury as well as the Small Business Administration are scrambling to try and figure out how do you validate the identities of citizens and small businesses that are eligible to be getting new benefits under the CARES Act, as are a lot of the companies who are participating as lending partners with the Small Business Administration. It's really important to be delivering dollars to everybody in as quick a fashion as possible. You also want to make sure that you've got some controls in place to make sure the dollars go to the people who are supposed to get it and not the thousands of fraudsters who are now coming in as they're seeing over $2 trillion of aid on the table and trying to figure out if they can get a piece of it. We're seeing a huge increase in things like phishing attacks and other identity fraud attacks, looking to trick people to giving up some of their personal information or their login information. I'm expecting that's probably going to be on the rise with the launch of the new IRS portal today, and we can talk a little bit about what government's actually doing. I think, what I'd open with in terms of describing the state of things right now is there's, some real trade-offs that are being considered between getting dollars as quickly as possible out to people who are in, many cases, absolutely desperate situations and trying to put the controls in place to, stop potential fraudsters or, criminals who are looking to, take advantage of this for nefarious purposes. And I think where we're at today, because we don't really have a robust digital identity infrastructure in the U.S., is we're going to push dollars out as quickly as we can and, do what's technically feasible today with the tools that we have to try and verify identity and try to stop fraud and crime. But most of the folks who I've been talking to in government have sort of acknowledged the real politics of the situation, which is they're going to push dollars out quickly, and we're going to see a lot of the stories afterwards about where dollars did not go to the right place. And, that's something that will, be a problem for later this year or next year. But there's not ways that you can solve this lack of digital identity infrastructure easily in, just a couple of weeks. And so I think we'll talk about what that might look like in the future in terms of, putting something better in place for the next time we have an issue, or frankly, just enabling trusted digital transactions and, day-to-day commerce.
And so, I mean, this is, I'm gonna look to David here first, 'cause I think, when we're preparing for this conversation, there's really this, what, Jeremy laid out here is this sort of, what can we do in the short term, and then what does the long term look like? And I mean, from your perspective with the regulators, in the market, like, is the short term going to be good enough for us, and how is this going to knock on in the long term if we're going to be pushing dollars out the door?
Parker, at the end of the day, what we have is a 20th century government with a 20th century technology infrastructure facing a 21st century pandemic. And the needs that we have are really, 21st technology needs that we just don't have in place. And it's nobody's fault per se, right? We've had a system that has worked based on the technology that we had at that time. What we haven't done is really kept up with the changes that have taken place in the last decade. And the implications of this are very broad. In terms of what we're facing in the short term, in terms of getting the PPP dollars out as fast as possible and to as many people as possible, there's a natural trade-off that we're going to be facing. Jeremy alluded to it before, where the faster you move the funds, the more likely you're going to have a level of fraud. And as an ecosystem, if we want those funds to go out quickly, we're going to have to become comfortable with a level of fraud that we can't control. The shame of the situation is that the technology exists today to actually really actively control a lot of that fraud, and we just don't have that in place yet. So if you look at what's possible for us to address in the next 2 to 3 weeks as we roll out the existing PPP, and Congress, of course, is talking about augmenting that with an additional $250 billion. There isn't a whole lot of specific steps that we can do to try to fix that situation in the short term. But the COVID crisis hasn't broken our financial system. What it's done is it has highlighted the areas in which our financial system was already not working. And so what this implies is the opportunities that we have at our fingertips to really try to address these critical issues really in the aftermath of this crisis. And addressing digital ideas is clearly one of the critical steps that we need to take.
And I mean, Stu, to bring you in here and really just this just from what you just said, David, reminds me of why the Better Identity Coalition was set up. I mean, is this even more acute because of sort of the identity problem that has been erupting in front of us, or let's say erupting is maybe, you could use that term now, but it has been rapidly evolving over, ever since the Equifax hack, and that sort of just, it's not even, let's say, my name and where I live and my SSN anymore. It's my username and password. It's a whole series of other problems out in the market. I mean, is this like compounding on top of a 20th century, infrastructure we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I mean, I step back a little bit and say, certainly, putting a major digital identity infrastructure in place, we know has been a need for many, many years. And there's always been, what's the compelling, what really drives it, right? And what really gets it established. And actually something like, this pandemic is actually an opportunity to get, government and private sector collaborating to put this together, right? Get the funds, put the task force together, get the innovation money for the DMVs to be enabled with, attribute sharing, and because we have the data, right? We've got bank data, we've got government data, we've got phone data, that we got plenty of signals to bring strong identity into digital economy, right? The pieces are there. It's stitching it together and getting, the policy, the governance, and everybody really, doing the work to actually build it out, and to collaborate, right? Because, right now we know it's all stovepiped. So I think this is actually quite a nice opportunity, to get, from the Hill some infrastructure funds to accelerate this, so we're ready for the next, not just pandemic, but the next crisis of any kind, financial, health, etc. And certainly, we feel like we can help in terms of, being kind of the market organizer, and helping to bring the parties together and set the rules, the obligations, the rights, right? The privacy preserving rights, and all the things that are actually really important around principles for digital identity that we all know need to be there. I think it is all very feasible, and I think this kind of thing right now puts the opportunity right in front of us to make it happen at like a national scale, right? Rather than a small, niche use case, really do it at a national scale and get the senior funds and the right people behind it to do it.
And Jeremy, I mean, you went through the portal of what the IRS has built, right? If you haven't filed taxes to get access to your check, and looking at some of these initiatives that we put forward with the Better Identity Coalition, like how far away are we, or is this again, you had your market making moment when everyone realized that identity was a problem we wanted to pay to solve, and now it's being laid bare in a very obvious way. Like, how much has this changed and accelerated the conversations from trying to get this money together, or to try to drive the infrastructure forward, or the ecosystem forward?
Well, I think it's certainly gotten a lot of attention on things. I'm just eager for a time that we can start to get attention on this without a crisis. So, I mentioned earlier that, the coalition was launched in the wake of the Equifax breach, which was the last time I think people started to be, become aware of the fact that we had a bit of a crisis in identity. Although then it was more concerned about what did it mean that a company that's such a big player in the identity space had a breach. We weren't actually dealing with, how can I say it? The concerns then were hypothetical. What if this stolen information is suddenly used against us? Now we're in a situation that's really different, which is we can't do anything in person anymore, so everything has to be digital, and we need to know who's who. So, talking about the IRS portal, I was just perusing it because it, launched earlier today. I mean, from a, Treasury Department perspective, they're really trying to figure out a few simple things. Are you real? Where do you live, so I know where to send a check? Or can I actually match you up with a real bank account so I can just send a direct deposit and not have to put something in the mail to you? And as simple as that sounds, it's not so simple. So they're leaning a lot, for a lot of people, if you filed your taxes in 2018 or 2019, they'll look at your income information to see if you're eligible. And let's say you got a refund, so they have your checking account on file. They'll just send you the money through direct deposit. That's great for those people, assuming that most of them are real. I won't even get into the issue of tax return fraud and things like that. But let's assume that you got a good chunk of accurate information there. Well, what if you didn't file yet your 2019 taxes? I mean, today's April 15th. I haven't filed mine. I'm taking advantage of the 3 months. And let's say I moved, or let's say I had a new bank account in the last year. Well, what they say is, if you did that, there's no way you can update it with us other than to file your 2019 tax return, which is just not going to be feasible for a lot of people. Ideally, it'd be nice if there was some way I could, had a credential already that was secure, that was portable, that I could, that had validated identity information I could use to log into the IRS to update that information. But that's the kind of infrastructure we just don't have. Likewise, there's a good chunk of the country that does not file taxes each year for different reasons. In many cases, they might not make enough to actually have to owe, so they don't bother. So there, they've set up a separate portal again, IRS is really scrambling here. These folks, I was on the phone with some Treasury people earlier today. Everybody's working till midnight every night. I don't want to be diminishing in any way the effort that's being made. But because, again, we were lacking infrastructure, what they've come up with is a portal where you enter in your name, your mailing address, your date of birth, your social security number, your bank account data if you have one, and your driver's license data if you have one. Well, a lot of this stuff, thanks to the epidemic of breaches we've had over the last 7 or 8 years, isn't the secret. A lot of it's in the public domain, or it's at least in the domain of organized criminal gangs. You can bet are going to be actively probing this today to see if they can divert legitimate dollars that are supposed to be going to different Americans to what they're doing instead. You can bet that you're going to be seeing phishing attacks and others focused on getting people to enter that information, in many cases being disguised as the IRS. Again, if people had a portable credential that had this reliable information, if there was some sort of digital identity infrastructure, there'd be an easier way to do this. So a lot of where the coalition's been focused is looking at, how do we get there? And briefly, we could talk a lot about it, but we published, I even have my prop here, physical, but it still translates online. Go to betteridentity.org to read the whole thing. But we published this blueprint, a little hefty, about 47 pages, back in the summer of 2018, laying out what are the things government actually can do to help. And to be clear, a couple things. One, government can't solve the problem on its own. It's companies like MasterCard and Onfido that are really at the forefront right now of innovation in the space. But government's going to have to play a role in that. At the end of the day, the government is the only authoritative issuer of identity. And while there's some really good solutions in the private sector that are, getting us a good chunk of the way there, we're only going to get so far at the end of the day unless we can also find a way for the government to play some sort of a role, because nobody else can substitute for the role that the government plays. And so I think, the key takeaway from what the coalition's been calling, for and working toward with policymakers is calling for the government to get into the game. And then, from there, the first question that pops into most people's minds is, boy, that could be really spooky or scary. So how do we actually come up with a model that we could have the government play a role that actually enhances security and enhances privacy? And the answer there is you flip what I would call, the old model of, let's just give everybody a national ID and you'll have to carry it. We'll flip that on its head to say, why don't we just look to leverage the existing nationally recognized authoritative identity systems that we have already in this country, things like the driver's license, passport, the social security number, at least as an identifier, and set up solutions where any of us could ask the government to vouch for us, say to the IRS, that, if we're trying to get aid, or to vouch to a bank if I'm trying to get a loan for my small business. There's, a lot of the information is there already, but it's just locked up in the paper and plastic world. And we need to find a way where consumers can ask that also translates into the digital.
So that's great. I want to take this moment to sort of pivot into like, where can we go with this? And David, I'm gonna ask you to sort of, from that regulatory point of view, what are some of the pieces, one, you're actively working on that you alluded to in your intro, and two, what are these pieces we're going to need to let's say help industry play their role, and what does that sort of cross-pollination look at? For everyone who's on for the webinar, you have the ability to ask questions. It is a very empty question piece. Either this is riveting content and we're telling you guys amazing things, which that's what I'm gonna lead with right now. But please, we're gonna reserve some time at the end. Please start populating with questions if you have them. And just a reminder, we can have hopefully a dialogue through the question box here. But going back to you, David, look, there's a lot of things. If we focus the first half of the webinar on the short term, I mean, what are those long-term pieces, and focusing in on your work, what are that we need to do to enable the regulators?
And I want to kind of circle back to a couple of the comments that Jeremy said, because they really are pertinent, right? I mean, this is bigger than just the government. This is an ecosystem problem, and it requires all of the stakeholders to come to the table and work together to solve these problems. from an innovation perspective, at its most fundamental base, many of us in the United States have been certified. We have been verified. We've gone through know your customer processes, right? From a conceptual perspective, you've got to be able to ask the question, if I have been KYC'd at Chase Bank, why am I not able to use that in other ways? If I've already been KYC'd effectively. And if you think about all the places in our lives where we have to go through a KYC process, it's just duplicated effort. It's a bad customer experience. It traps all of this data in silos. And so, harking back to Stu's recognition of how important privacy is, there are ways that we can solve this problem and share the actual, verification of an identity without transgressing privacy. That technology exists, that technology is being developed, and what we need to do is bring together the different parts of the ecosystem to actually start to execute against that. These situations have real life challenges, right? The fact that we can't digitally ID somebody is one of the primary reasons that small businesses are not able to apply for PPP loans, right? So, if you happen to bank in a bank that has already KYC'd you and they're participating in the SBA's PPP program, then you have access to actually apply to that program. But if you happen to just bank with a smaller regional bank or a community bank or a credit union or even a fintech that doesn't have that same level of sophisticated technology, then you're just kind of out of luck. You might be KYC'd with a particular community bank, but if they're not participating in the program, you don't have access to those funds, and you don't have the option to go to a different supplier, a different provider, because they can't use digital technology to KYC you in the same way. So, what we're seeing, and this is what our BankThink article is about, is that there are huge swaths of small businesses that just don't have access to the PPP program because of the way that it's currently being delivered. And a large portion of that, a large issue around that, is this digital ID. I think that what we're really hoping for in the short term is working with the limited solutions that we have to try to help facilitate the distribution of those funds. But as you start to think through, what a long-term strategy is, you really need to put innovation at the core of what we're doing. This is no longer an option. This is no longer, fintech working at the margins of the financial, the financial system. This is really taking a question like digital ID and bringing it forth. One of the proposals that we have on the table is to use tech sprint, or what's commonly known as a hackathon. And this is a really powerful tool to help drive innovation forward, because what happens is that you bring together participants from across different stakeholders, and you work on a single team where you have subject matter experts that are really knowledgeable, say, about privacy, and technologists that really understand the digital capabilities of the systems that are being innovated today. And you bring them together side by side, and you actually work on solving a problem where the output is, over the course of an intense 2-day, 3-day, 5-day problem solving system, actually create code and demonstration projects that actually solve a very specific problem. And so we have worked with government regulatory agencies in the past. We actually led a tech sprint on financial crime that was really focused on human trafficking. And just 2 weeks ago, we did another tech sprint that was very specific to how to enable smaller banks to interface and access with the PPP. But this is the same technology, the same kind of innovation strategy that you could use to bring together disparate parties to help problem solve around the digital ID. And there is a real, as opposed to in the past where there wasn't such a clear economic argument for this, like after the Equifax breach, for example, today what we're looking at is tremendous amounts of fraud. And the dollar amounts of the fraud that we're going to be, looking back on when this program is over, some percentage of that fraud could have been solved by a digital ID solution. There is a real, there's a real case here to be made for the money that could be saved if we invested nationally and across the entire ecosystem in digital ID.
So with that being said, and I'm going to pick up on a question here and kick it over to Stu, and from sort of the MasterCard point of view, and the question comes from Adam saying, what if anything can SBA and IRS do to identify fraudulent claims being made with accurate but stolen PII? Which I think this is going, which is hitting to sort of a big piece here where they're saying they can't to sort of this space approach, but what are the what?
No, it's static data, right?
Yeah.
It's just, we know is so vulnerable. It's the source of just a huge part of the fraud, right? And the frustrating thing is we do have technology to solve this, right? That, biometrics have been around for a long time. They've obviously gotten better with phone technology that's come out in recent years. And the good thing is we can do this with privacy, right? With user-centric, user-controlled use of their identity. So we can bring in, dynamic signals like, liveness. This is a live person on the other end of this, right? With live, face, and then match that to ID documents, the kind of solutions that you guys on FIDO do, along with others, right? To provide, this is me, and this face matches this document, and this document is authentic, which just brings a much stronger identity than a set of static data. So really, I think, using a combination of technology, that's enabled with user-centric policy and consent, we can do really, get rid of a lot of the fraud and bring those solutions to bear, for the next round.
Jeremy.
And I want to say it's not just about fraud, it's also about better customer experiences. So I think everybody's really focused on the fraud right now because $2 trillion is a lot of money to be out on the table in a month-long period for folks to go after. But a lot of this I think also comes down to just how do you enable digital transformation? How do you enable better customer experiences? And so I think while the crisis is getting some attention on this issue, the benefits are going to be much more long-term. Certainly from an electronic government perspective, back when I was at NIST years ago, we did a joint, study with IRS looking at what do they offer online today. The answer was not much because they really don't know who's, the proverbial dog on the internet. And so looking at, what would it mean a few years from now if, say, 30, 50, 70% of the population came into the IRS with a credential that could be trusted by that agency? What could they save? The answer was potentially over $300 million a year in terms of, what does it cost to run a call center? What does it cost to run brick and mortar? What's it cost to do things through the mail? The more you can process digitally, the better. One of the big reasons that IRS has pushed more people to e-file is it costs them just a few pennies to process an electronically filed tax return. It costs them a few dollars to do one that comes in on paper. So there's a lot of efficiencies here. When you can get this sort of thing in place, that, beyond giving you resiliency for the next crisis, hopefully we don't have one, but assuming something's going to happen, it just enables a better foundation for, what you can do digitally. The other point I want to say with that is one of the things I also worry about from the U.S. perspective is we're falling behind. So, there was, seeing how other countries are reacting to some of this, there was something about 2 weeks ago the European Commission put out that was basically boasting about how, because they've invested so much in EID and e-government, their take was, thanks to the trust enablers of EID and the EIDAS regulation, citizens don't need to leave their homes to interact with the public administrations. They don't need to be face-to-face to sign or even mail documents, and this is another way to achieve social distancing. And, I'm looking at this and contrasting, what's happening in Europe right now to what we have here in the U.S. There's other countries, Canada, the UK, Australia, where I know, Stu's been particularly involved, that have also been investing here. And we're really starting to fall behind. And it's getting to be a bit of an issue from, an economic competitiveness standpoint.
Yeah, because I was going to bring up a question of sort of one, is the U.S. behind, let's say, other wealthier first world countries? And I would argue yes, and that's probably for a series of what we've been talking here on a tech front, but also sort of a cultural front and the way that our government is set up. But there's two questions here that are sat here, one sort of addressing, especially with the state of U.S. politics that's so polarized at the moment. Is this a bipartisan issue, or is this, because of where we stand right now and the challenges we have, is this something that is no longer, just being what was it ever? I don't think it was ever a one-party issue, but it does seem like it's now getting to a point where it's getting us there. And I think, Jeremy, I'll ask you that question, because then Stu and David, I want to follow on to this, and Jeremy probably want to ask this, is how do we get the average ordinary American, again, coming back to Roger's question here, and to trust either big tech after everything that's happened? Thank you to, what's happened with Facebook and everything else we see. And we're doing, we're not doing this on Zoom, but Zoom hasn't, has had some serious things exposed. So there's a distrust of tech, and obviously there's probably a distrust of government. And so, that's a much more burlier question, but, one, is it bipartisan at this point in time? And two, what is that education we have to do to get average users to start trusting to do something digitally, where right now the US doesn't have a great track record of that?
Yeah, so I think it can be bipartisan, but a lot of it depends on how it's scoped. To date, the work we've been driving from the coalition has had really good response, on a bipartisan basis. And part of that was because we went out of our way to avoid some of the hot button issues on identity that can get very political. I've got some pretty strong views on things like voter ID and immigration, but we don't touch that in the blueprint because, honestly, our take was things are too politicized there. And if we focus on them much, it's going to distract from the other things that we actually can get done. And so the take was not to set aside the importance of those issues at all, but if we can't make progress in one area and we can in others, let's try to do so. So I'd say in the couple of years since we launched the coalition, we've actually done really well on that front. When we released our policy blueprint in 2018, we had both the Republican and Democratic co-chairs of the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus, Mike McCall from Texas and Congressman Jim Langevin from Rhode Island came and spoke, and both said nice things about it. Grant Snyder, who's the U.S. government CISO over at the White House as well. I've testified before Congress 3 times in the last 2 years. Even though I used to work for the Obama administration, I was invited all 3 times by the Republican staff putting it together. So this really has been something where there hasn't been partisanship, and I think there's some consensus on some of the key things that we put forth in our blueprint as a path forward. Now, I do think that if something starts to happen on the policy front and these other issues start to get glued onto it, it's going to make it difficult because there just are a lot of things that are very political when it comes to identity.
Yeah, I mean, and David and I'll start with Stu, because I'm gonna change it up here. Is so, like, on the educational side, on the ordinary side, I mean, I personally think identity is tracking where payments has gone, right? You look at it, went from cash to cards to that wonderful taking it across the sheet into putting your card into signing for it, as an evolution, and it feels very much like identity is tracking in that same scope. But my wife is British, and when the US, I had to teach her how to write a check. She'd never done it before. What you spell out the number, I don't understand, right? And so we need to accelerate sort of the adoption, but how do we get everyone comfortable with it? And and obviously MasterCard has a little bit of history in this type of evolution.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's not trivial, right? I mean, first of all, it's got to be super simple, like super intuitive, right? So in other words, today we're using Google and Facebook and all this, and our data is being shared without us knowing it, right? So you're like, all right, we're trying to introduce a new model that allows that kind of simplicity, but also provides informed, very simple, explicit consent. So I feel like I'm in control of my data now, right? So that's like a really key principle. The user feels like, okay, I've got some verified data, simply, put anchored in something I trust. My bank has verified me, right? I've got a bank account, I've done a KYC, and they've verified me. So that's one anchor of identity data. Shouldn't I be able to take that data and share it with another party with consent, right, in a transaction, right? So I want to, financial or non-financial, right? So with education and with giving users really very, simple controls over their data, we think that's very important. And the other key thing is trusted brands, right? People are going to trust in things they've already got trust in to some extent. So bringing in brands, so that's where we feel like bringing a collaboration of key brand, bringing government in, institutions that people do have trust in, banks where they trust their money, other parties, identity providers, telcos, that can all really bring a lot of value to getting this adoption started. And obviously compelling use cases, right? Solving a problem with a good user experience, right? Because we know the user experience isn't good now, so we can certainly improve, provide an offer to improve user experience, but actually create the trust and be very open with the governance principles, right? The rights that people have, the obligations, the ability to have dispute, and resolve disputes when things go wrong. Those are all kind of key principles we need to bring into the system.
I mean, before we take over, David, I just want to say and I'll be the one that brings it up. We almost made it through a webinar without talking about CCPA or GDPR and how all that's even.
Well, I was just about
another full hour. But David, I mean, do they help in this but also again, also getting the regulators comfortable. I mean, it's another big task here for us, but is that privacy and gonna be the thing that gives people the trust?
You run a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, something like GDPR actually sets a benchmark internationally, and we're in a kind of a unique seat where we can kind of look at both the impact of that and perhaps the unintended impacts of that as well. I do think that part of the challenge here is that many of the issues that it brings up are partisan and are trigger points for each of the parties. And so the key, like Jeremy said, is to really stay in a space where there's obvious collaboration. And I think that barring federal legislation on privacy, which would certainly help, but would be very difficult to pass. I do think that what Stu referred to as creating a set of principles around which this coalition would work is really critical. What are the key principles that we want to put in place with any kind of private digital ID solution that takes into account privacy issues? So if you think about Dodd-Frank, Section 1033, it's 25 words. It's really short and really simple. The customer has the rights to their data. What we're still in the throes of is what exactly does that mean, and how, as an ecosystem, are we going to execute that? But I think the key here is that we need to start taking actions in that direction. Along the lines of what Stu said, to really help us define what the boundaries are. These are very difficult challenges, because the whole notion of innovation is that you are wandering into the space of the unknown. And that's really hard. It's really hard for every stakeholder in the ecosystem, because people don't know what the unintended impacts are and they're concerned about them. I think I might go out on a limb here and say, as players in the ecosystem, we have to go out on a limb and put a stake in the ground around some of these innovations. And what we know from past experiences is that some of them will work and some of them won't work. And we have to develop a level of comfort with failure and be willing to, first of all, identify when something fails, and number two, be able to remediate against it very quickly. But without being able to move, without the willingness to take the risk, we're not going to actually be able to move into the space of innovation.
Yeah, so for sort of the last 12 minutes here, we don't have to take up the full time, but and I hate that question of like, what's your prediction where we're going to be? But for the people who are on the panel and come to this, what are some of the key things they should be looking at? Either highlighting some of the trends we've talked about here, and or what are the pieces where maybe there's a way for you to sort of, I don't want to say take advantage of, but start to move your sort of your digital onboarding, your digital experience forward. And so let's go with Stu, and then Jeremy, and then David will finish with you here. But Stu, I mean, what would you leave everyone with the idea that we'll probably wake up tomorrow morning and some of the stuff we talked about today will be pointless. I can't listen to podcasts that are like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, because they talk about things with like COVID-19 and you're like, that sounds so naive a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So keep that in mind. Someone may be listening to this in a week and what we're talking about means nothing. So what should the takeaways be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the takeaway that this situation is bringing to the forefront, right? That this fundamental, the U.S. is behind, and it is creating, an obvious need and time to step it up and really bring digital, enabling a digital economy, right? That's where the world's got to get to. So it's innovating with the governance and controls around it, and this is all a doable thing, right? It is, let's get together and collaborate and get the government to sponsor some of this, right? Without implementing, we can, private sector can do the heavy lifting, but with government sponsorship to really create, more of a national infrastructure. So we're competing, and playing catch up and jumping ahead potentially of Canada, Australia, other countries. We have the tools, frankly, and I think this kind of pandemic opportunity situation is bringing to light that it's time to act, and BIC, Better Identity Coalition, has done a lot of great thinking and a lot of lobbying. Let's now turn it into next level actions. So I think collaboration is really key, and bringing the right parties together to do that.
Jeremy, over to you, sir.
Yeah, so I'd say, look, in terms of what you do today, the answer is use the tools that are out there. And even if they're not perfect, good is still pretty good. So, as I've been talking both to, private sector clients as well as folks in government, there are identity verification tools that are there today, like ones that Onfido has, that can get you some really good stuff. But, the core goal for where we're focused, for the name of the coalition, is how do you make identity better? And, our message, again, I've had folks from government, they were really hoping, I got you guys on the phone, you're going to tell us something we can do that's going to fix this next week? No, we're not going to have that. This is going to take a couple years. I do think, I'd say I'm more optimistic than ever that because all of these issues are just being laid bare right now, that sometime in the next 6 months or so, we're actually going to see an infrastructure bill go forward that might actually start to put some real resources and some policy changes behind some of the things that we're talking about. But, this is going to take some time. And so in the meantime, if you're on this webinar and you're trying to figure out, what to do, well, use the tools that are in the market today. People buy them for a reason. They still work a lot of the time. We just want things to be better.
Great. David?
And I would summarize by saying, again, we have a 20th century government that is operating in a 21st century world, and there is a huge opportunity to upgrade our technology infrastructure. I think it's really clear that that the weaknesses in our current infrastructure that have been exposed by the pandemic, are weaknesses that are fundamental and structural, and we're just seeing the impact of them today in a way that we didn't see them 2 months ago. I agree with Jeremy. I think that this is an incredible call to action. I think that this is waking people up to the notion that innovation is not an option. We have to move forward, and we have to actually transform the system. There's a huge opportunity to transform the financial services system and the regulatory system that accompanies it with a different, digitally native approach. And I think that this whole situation really puts that opportunity front and center. We have the opportunity to, save costs, to really improve the customer experience, protect the consumer from harm, at the same time that we can increase efficiency and effectiveness of the regulatory system, all by implementing technology. Technology can really push us in that direction. And what's been missing up until now is the call to action that really brings all of the different stakeholders to the table. And I think that's really what could possibly change, and what I think for each of us who play a role in this ecosystem, we have to work towards changing that.
Well, look, from my perspective here, one, has been fantastic to facilitate a call with you three gentlemen today, or a webinar here. Look, when I came from payments into identity, pretty much 4 years ago to the day, it really sort of struck me of what more of a, let's say, ecosystem play, as I think we've all said here, where it's just, as Unfido, we think we play a critical role of tying someone's digital footprint to the carbon-based human that owns it. But we're only one blade in our client's tech stack. And if you're using us as your sort of prevention of fraud, you're going to be in trouble. And we all need to sort of pull this together and look at how to make it move forward in a much more meaningful way. So with that, thank you all very much. Obviously, for everyone else on who's joined us, we appreciate your time and listen to us talk through the issues and some of the trends. And Stu wants to have one last question or comment.
Just one last comment to Jeremy, and I have to compliment you on that jacket, because
Thank you.
I actually was proud of myself that I went from a t-shirt to a button down. I was like, well, I'm dressing up, but you really stepped it up to a jacket. So next time, I'll bring the jacket.
I appreciate it. We all got to keep our games at a high level during this period. So
That's great.
It's all relative.
And I want to claim the most interesting background compared to you guys.
Well, I don't know what I can lay claim to, but you guys have all been fantastic, and I appreciate it. And we'll be mailing this out. This will be on a platform called I want to say it's Brightwire. I don't know, but we'll send it out to everyone who's registered. And again, thank you all for the time. And this is us signing off. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.